So welcome to the final lecture. I am very happy to present you our special guest, Jordan Cotler, arriving here from Harvard University, who will essentially wrap up the curriculum of this class by showing us his original work and results on the connection between self-replication and computation. And I think it's a rare opportunity to see the results being taught in class directly by the authors. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be back at EPFL. I was actually here exactly a year ago for a workshop about artificial life, and Barbara, as usual, was being modest. She's also a co-author on this work, so it's original work due to both of us, as well as Colin Angler. And the topic of this lecture is self-replication and computational universality. And because I have the opportunity to tell you a bit about my perspective on the subject, I'll take this opportunity to inculcate you a little bit into a certain way of thinking about artificial life that maybe Barbara will have some other closing thoughts in the second half. So I take it that one of the difficult questions about figuring out a theory of living systems is answering the question, how do you define what a living system is? So to give an example, we have this table, and if I took a chunk out of this table and I put it on the floor, then the chunk that was taken out of the table wouldn't mind very much, nothing much would happen, and the table would be perfectly fine. But if you removed part of my heart, for example, or my liver, and you put it on the floor, well then I probably wouldn't do so well. Maybe the liver a little bit better, because maybe it'll grow back. But then the piece of liver on the floor also wouldn't do particularly well. So there's a sense in which the self-organization of my own biological structures is very different than the physical composition of the table and the way that the subsystems interact and the way that that it tries to sustain its form or not sustain its form. And the question I think that is fascinating to me about the subject of a life or living systems is the question, if I gave you a video of a physical system, some simulation or whatever it is, what algorithm would you write down to circumscribe the dynamical subsystems that are living? And if I show you a video of a bunch of paramecium or a bunch of worms, how would you actually know in general what is the algorithm for figuring out what are the physical subsystems that are living versus the things that are inanimate? How would you actually decide that? So indeed, one of the goals of this subject is to articulate the dynamical, computational, and organizational principles which explain how, when, and why matter is living. So in this lecture, we're going to take a first pass at an easier problem, which is that of self-replication. Indeed, there are certain systems which, for example, single cellular organisms which can self-replicate. Now, we might say that they're living in some modest sense. But our goal, the question we're going to try to ask is, when does a physical system contain physical components undergoing self-replication? And actually, it's trickier to define self-replication than you might think. So before we get to the mathematical definition, I want to play a game with you. And here's how the game works. So here's a game. The game is called, is it self-replicating or not? So the way the game works is that you don't win anything if you get the right answer, although I'm told that Barbara will give you lots of extra credit or something like this. Perhaps not. Okay, so let me give some examples. And so the key is that you have to tell me whether you think it's self-replicating or not, but you also have to say why, because just a yes or no answer is not interesting. Okay, so here's one example. I'll try to draw pictures. Suppose that we have a glass of water. So here's some water, and I put a little bit of dye, a drop of dye in the water. So as this evolves in time, then what's going to happen is that the dye is going to diffuse. If it was red dye, then you're going to have a bigger blotch of red. Is this self-replicating or not? There's a little bit of red, and now there's a lot more red. Okay, audience participation, yes, go ahead.
No, because it will be diffused, so it will not be the same composition, I guess, in the dye.
Good. Okay, so you could say that because of sort of conservation of matter, for example, that the amount of dye is actually the same, in the small thing versus the large thing. Of course, one has to be a little bit careful because there is always conservation of matter, and when a cell builds another copy of itself, it co-opts matter to build another copy. But I would take your answer as being that the particular form which dye takes stays intact in this diffusion process, and it merely is spreading out. It is not literally creating more copies of itself. Okay, that's a good answer. Maybe a few points of extra credit. You can bump up his grade a little bit. Okay, but now we're going to do a harder version of the question. So here's example 2. So suppose that we have, okay, this is just going to get a little harder to draw. Suppose that we have a printer. I think this roughly looks like a printer. Little text here. Very good. And so here's a printer. And suppose that the printer, oh yeah, so in this first case, we'll put an X. No, this is not self-replicating. Very good. So we have a printer that now has loaded a single file, like a single Microsoft Word document. And whenever I push the printer, it will print out exactly that one document. Every time you push the button, it'll print out another copy of the same document. Is this self-replicating? What's, yes?
I would say no, because while there is replication, it's not really self-replication. It doesn't print another printer, it prints something else.
Good. So, okay, so that's a good answer. So the answer is, well, it's not printing out another printer. Of course, if it was a 3D printer, it could possibly print another printer. But maybe another related answer that you might say is that it's not that the copying mechanism is lacking some capability of doing something counterfactual. In other words, because there's only one file loaded, it's not that it can actually print a whole variety of things as it stands. Maybe if we reprogrammed it. But the idea somehow is that also a good replication mechanism should be a mechanism that could replicate many versions of a thing. That somehow just being able to produce copies of a single thing doesn't mean that the mechanism is general enough to copy, a mutated organism or something more general. So in that sense, it fails in two ways. It's not printing another printer, and it could only print a single thing. So I'll give one last example that maybe is related more to what you were saying, is that if we had a copy machine, okay, now to refer to my picture of how to draw a copy machine. So the copy machine in my office looks something like this. So it has some, panels and whatever, like this. It's on some wheels. It's always broken. Very good. And the copy machine over the printer with the single file loaded has the advantage that it can now copy anything you put into it. If you give me any piece of paper, you can slide it in, it'll print out a copy. But as you also pointed out, so maybe extra credit for you, it also will not be printing another copy of a copy machine itself. So what you see, though, is that if you wanted to sit down and write down a mathematical definition of what it means for self-replication, you would have to think through these different issues. That, okay, well, which things actually constitute genuine, non-trivial self-replication? It's not merely that you're getting more of things, but you're getting more of things in the right kind of way. So this just means to convince you that, this is a non-trivial exercise. So let me move this up here. Okay. Good? Great. So what we have done in this exercise as a toy model is that we have articulated progressively more stringent, necessary, but not sufficient conditions for non-trivial self-replication. In a certain sense, these examples are getting better and better in certain ways, although we certainly, I still don't think that we would say that the copy machine is actually doing self-replication. But nonetheless, we've figured out some better and better ways of articulating what self-replication is not, and perhaps thus what it is. Now, what we're going to do now is to articulate a useful example of such a necessary condition in the context of cellular automata. So we're going to try to write down a technical definition which is going to satisfy some of the intuitions that we've built up in this game, and use that to figure out whether a CA has any chance of being able to furnish configurations which self-replicate. Does that make sense as a premise? Okay, good. All right, so first, let's say that each CA organism So what do I mean by a CA organism? Well, let's keep this vague for a moment, but what we want to imagine is that we have some cellular automata. So here's the arena of a cellular automata. Maybe it goes on infinitely in every direction. A CA organism in our minds is going to be, some configuration, something here, which is going to have dynamical activity, is going to evolve in time, and is going to do things, such as self-replicate possibly, that we would like to characterize. So this will become more precise, but when we say a CA organism, we mean like a little critter, a little blob in the CA, which is a little machine which is doing something. Okay? Like in the game of life, it would be, some little gadget inside. So first, we're going to say that each CA organism is in part characterized by a sequence of patterns, which we'll define more precisely. So what is a pattern? A pattern, which is mathcal-p, for those of you who speak LaTeX, is, in fact, it's bold mathcal-p, but that I can't really draw, is a sequence of patterns. So this is P0, P1 through Pt minus 1. And we'll say that this describes, I'll put this in quotes, a canonical form of activity. This is a piece of jargon, but what does it mean? It means that if we have any organism worth its salt, that it's going to be doing something. That this is a little dance, a little jig that it does. It moves around from this configuration to this one and this one. And this is like a little movie of something that it might do. For example, it could be an action that it does in collecting resources for food. It could be an action that it does in the process of self-replication. It's some type of non-trivial dynamics which a sub-configuration of a cellular automata can perform dynamically. Does that make sense intuitively? It's like a little movie clip of this little thing. All right. So now in order for the organism to self-replicate, the idea is that this activity, if you like, this canonical form of activity, has to be present in a growing number of disjoint regions of the cellular automata as the cellular automata evolves. So what's the picture that we should have for this? So the picture, so here's our cellular automata space, and maybe it goes on forever. So suppose that we have our little critter here, which is doing its little dance. It's doing something that it does. Then if it indeed was self-replicating, then at some later time, the later time will be in our imagination. I'll kind of superimpose all of the images. At some later time, maybe now there are two little critters. Maybe this one's rotated. Maybe there's now two little critters who are doing the same pattern of activity later. And then maybe later, there are three critters doing the same pattern of activity. So to clarify, the idea then is that one condition that we might want to articulate for self-replication is that if we have one little critter that is doing some dynamical action, that at progressively later times we get more disjoint copies of that object, maybe transformed geometrically, rotated, something like this, that are also doing the same action, maybe not in sync with one another, but nonetheless, that at some point they will all do the same pattern of activity. Now, one comment is that in this picture, I have been intentionally vague about a certain conceptual point, which is that, so the arrows sort of mean, if you like, what I mean by this picture is that here is sort of what's happening at time 1, and this is maybe what's happening at some later time, and then maybe this is happening at some later time, right? So this is sort of like a movie where I've sort of superimposed the different pictures. It's sometimes said that film is the spatialization of time, the temporalization of space, but this is not a class on film theory. So what's going on? Well, I've been ambiguous about whether these descendants are in fact replicates of the original organism, whether they're literally the offspring or whether they're just the same offspring themselves in the future. Because maybe, maybe this one guy begets a certain offspring which then replicates. So here's his descendants. And his or her descendants, and then down here is just the same offspring just sort of going along in its retirement. And so we don't really want to, so it's going to be useful not to distinguish between these two possibilities. We just want to say that there is a self-replication happening, or there's the possibility of self-replication, merely if the number of these organisms increase and continue to do the same dynamical motifs at some later time. There's just a larger number of things as a function of time performing the dynamical motifs. So does that make sense at the level of pictures? Okay. So the difficulty in this game is that one can write down pictures, but that they only pay you if you write down definitions and theorems. So that's what we have to do. So let's first have a kind of a question that I'm going to answer then by writing down the definition. The question that we're trying to circle around is, how do we count the number of copies of an organism and part of the idea of how we're going to approach this is that we're going to count dynamical patterns modulo simple geometric transformations. Okay. So is that any questions about this? Good. We're happy so far, or unhappy but silent. Good. All right. So let me move over to the other board and somehow move the camera to 6. Did it work? Very good. Okay. All right. So on this side of the room, I will be more rigorous. So let me give a series of definitions to satisfy the more rigorous among you. So this is going to be a definition of the equivalence of local patterns. So I will write down the definition. It will take a little bit because it's a bit of a long definition. So feel free to pay attention or zone out, and then at the end I will explain to you what it means. All right. So as usual, let our cellular automata be defined by some configuration space, s to the z to the d, and some evolution rule. Of course, in most physical systems, we might imagine that d is 1, 2, or 3. If you're a string theorist, you might want it to be 10, for example. No string theorists in this audience, I guess. So let this be a CA, and let R, which is a subset of z to the d, a subset of our lattice, let's this be a finite region. Okay. And let's also take t, which is going to be some time scale, to be in the natural numbers, a positive integer. And now we're going to consider a pattern, p, which is going to run from 0 to t minus 1. So this is a total of t time steps. So as a sequence, of distinct R patterns, let me underline, meaning, i.e., for each I between 0 and t, we have that P of I can be thought of as a map from R to S. Really, this is a map from R to S restricted to the region. Okay, so before I continue, let me just say what this means so far. All right, so we have our cellular automata. This is the configuration space. This is the dynamics. We're going to consider some subregion R, which is a little chunk of our universe. And we're going to consider some time. and we're going to say that we have some dynamical motif, or we have some pattern which persists for a time t, running from 0 to t minus 1, and it's going to be a sequence of distinct R patterns, but what this means intuitively is that when we define this region R, that this activity is all taking place inside this tiny little window R. That's what it means. So R is like the boundaries of our movie, and we have this movie for t time steps happening inside this subregion. So that's what we've articulated so far. All right, so let's keep articulating things. So we're going to refer to, so we're going to call this P, let me put this in quotes, a local pattern sequence with temporal length t or its nickname, a local pattern. Okay. So far, so good? All right. Let's move this up. Okay. So let's keep at it. Now suppose that we have another region R prime in our universe, and we have another pattern P prime, which goes it's another movie which lasts the same number of time steps. So we have a different region and we have a different movie. And suppose that this is another set of pairwise disjoint R prime patterns with the same temporal length. So I'm not going to write this out, but this is going to also be a local pattern, but this is a local pattern that takes place on R prime and also has the same length t, but might otherwise be different. Now what we want to do in this definition is to figure out what it means that this local pattern and that local pattern, the p and the p prime, are actually the same. So what do we mean by the same? Well, what we mean by the same is that this little movie, if it takes place over here, and there's another movie that's taking place over here, they're the same movie if they're related, for example, by, let's say, a reparameterization of time. That, maybe they're happening at slightly different time steps. And maybe this one over here is rotated and translated. It's in a different region. But if we take a movie and we turn it 90 degrees on its side, then maybe we still want to call that the same pattern of activity. So let's do that. So let's also suppose, okay, so we say that P and P prime are equivalent if there exists an isometry that takes the lattice to itself and an integer between 0 and t. I'll call the integral. I'll call the integer sigma, such that pi equals pi prime plus I, or let's say, yeah, sigma plus I mod t composed with phi for all 0 less than or equal to I less than t. So this is to say the patterns are equivalent if you can move them around and you can take one of them and you can rotate it and translate it by this isometry, for example, and you can also change the origin of time. Okay. All right, so let's keep going with our definition. So now what we want to say is when a configuration contains k copies of a pattern. So in other words, we want to ask, before we were talking about when we have a single pattern, then later on we have maybe two copies of the pattern and 3 copies and 59 copies and so on and so forth. So our idea is that we want to define what it means for a configuration to have, a certain number of copies of a pattern up to this notion of equivalence. All right. So for this, I'm going to go over to the other board since I need a bit more room. So any questions so far? Let me grab this piece of chalk. Any questions? Yes.
Here we consider two patterns that have the same length and time.
Mm-hmm.
So this would exclude patterns that are like the same thing but twice as fast, for example.
That's right. So one could make a more general definition where you could ask, for example, that things are, twice as slow might be easier because, of course, depending on the activity, you might, if it's discrete time steps, you can't make it any faster. But indeed, that's a way you could generalize it. So a point that I want to make more generally is that the definitions that we're writing down are some set of necessary or approximately necessary conditions for self-replication, but indeed, one can weaken it or have other variations of it that capture other intuitions. Okay. So we'll finish writing down our definitions, and then we will get to the punchline of what this buys us. We're not writing down the definitions for no reason. We want to prove something interesting and slightly surprising. So I promise you that that will happen. Okay. Okay. Very good. So let's continue. We'll continue with our definition. So let C be a configuration of our cellular automaton. And so this is let C be, let's see, a config of A. And let K be some integer greater than 1. And we say that C contains k copies of the pattern P. Let me underline. If there exist k disjoint regions R1 through Rk, which exists in our lattice z to the d, such that the configuration restricted to Ri and then f of the configuration restricted to Ri and so on to f to t minus 1 of the configuration restricted to Ri defines a local pattern equivalent to P for 1 less than I less than K. Okay. So let me underline a few things, and then we can have a little chat about this. So what does this mean? So this means that if you take our configuration and you evolve it in time by t steps, that's what this f is doing. We're applying the cellular automata dynamics a number of times. we say that if we look at the configuration, we look at this particular region, R sub I, where there's k different regions, R sub I, then we see up to equivalence this movie, this pattern that we were talking about, this pattern P. So that means that there are k distinct regions, or at least k distinct regions, in which this movie is taking place. And we're going to be, as a slight subtlety, we're going to be interested in cases where a configuration contains exactly k copies of a configuration, and not more, not less. So why do we care about exactly k copies? Because here's something that can go wrong in cellular automata. So if you have a cellular automata, it's this infinite grid, right, this infinite lattice, you might imagine that because of the periodic background structure of your lattice, you can have this thing happen where you have a little critter that is starting to multiply, but then all of a sudden, because you have this infinite, possibly periodic background configuration, you get infinitely many critters simultaneously. And all of the other critters just came from a sort of dumb artifact of the fact that you had some initial condition that was spatially periodic, which will also be then spatially and temporally periodic, which then produced, by virtue of the background itself, all of these other different movies. Meaning that they were not actually caused by your little critters that happen in the center of your universe. That they were just spontaneously generated by the initial conditions themselves. So to mitigate against this possibility, we're going to be interested in a set of circumstances where we only create a finite number, where we only have a finite number of equivalent patterns at any one time. In other words, if we ever have infinitely many patterns at one time, then we're not interested in that case, because it means that something about the background created the generation of these patterns and not the little critters themselves. Any questions about that? Does that make some intuitive sense? A different version of this is the following. Suppose that you were manufacturing cars, and people were saying, okay, well, we want to figure out what is your output of cars. But you happen to be in a universe with infinitely many cars produced by somebody else. You shouldn't count those in terms of your production. So we want to rule out. So if we said, okay, well, what we should do is that we should just count how many cars there are in the universe. So there's maybe one car, there's two cars, there's three cars, and if all of a sudden there's some person out there in the universe can create infinitely many cars, that wasn't due to you. And you should not be, it should not be counted towards your revenue. All right. So we're going to use this to give a definition of a self-replicating local pattern. And the idea is really simple. So we'll write down one more definition, and then we'll be on our way. Okay, so definition. A self-replicating local pattern So suppose that we have our cellular automata. We're going to use all the same notation, so I won't rewrite it. So we have our cellular automata A, we have our finite region R, and we have our time t. Okay. So we also are going to have a pattern P. Again, these are all the same objects that we have now become familiar with in the previous definition. And so suppose that C is a configuration of the cellular automaton. So we say that P self-replicates with configuration C if there exist two sequences of positive integers we write them out, n1 less than n2 less than n3. This is our first sequence. K1 less than K2 less than K3. This is the second sequence, such that Fni of C contains exactly ki copies of p up to our equivalence. So let me underline this. P self-replicates with configuration C. So what this means is that we have a self-replicating pattern, or P self-replicates with configuration C, if we can evolve our configuration to an increasing succession of times, such that in those times we get more and more copies of the pattern, but always a finite number. So we have exactly, K1, K2, K3, and so on copies. No more, no less. And of course, these times at which you're looking they don't have to be linearly separated. I mean, maybe it takes a while for the next round of organisms to show up. You can make these ends separated as far apart as you want. They can grow very, very fast or very, very slowly as long as they grow. And we also require, just as a proviso, that the configuration should be computationally feasible, by which we mean that if you have some nice background, for example, an admissible background, we want that our initial configuration agrees with an admissible background outside of a finite region. So you have some simple background, some simple periodic configuration, and your initial configuration should just be, should only differ from this simple background in a finite local patch. So it has the substrate, and then in this finite local patch, you can do something different, and it should sort of proliferate in some fashion. Now, let me say this in words. We'll define, maybe I'll put it actually down here. We're going to have also a definition of the local self-replicating condition. This is the intuitive consequence of the definition that I have just given. We're saying that a CA satisfies the local self-replicating condition, satisfies the condition if there exists, running out of chalk, a local pattern P with T greater than or equal to 2, which self-replicates in the weak sense that I have described previously. So that is, a cellular automata is capable of furnishing local self-replication if there exists some pattern with t greater than or equal to 2. Why do we need that? If t is not greater than or equal to 2, then we can do something very silly. The movie is just a still frame. Like an example is, suppose you have a cellular automaton which is all blank and it has a single black cell, and that cell just grows. That would be an example of a replicating local pattern with period 1, because nothing's happening. But with a higher period, you can get more interesting behavior. Now again, this is actually a pretty weak condition. I mean, many of the examples of self-replication that you would want, all of the ones that I know of satisfy this condition, but there's many things that you would not think are genuine self-replication that also satisfy this condition. You can come up with some examples of cellular automata that definitely satisfy the local self-replication condition, but do not stand to the scrutiny of actually being genuine self-replication in any sense of organisms. But nonetheless, this is supposed to be a necessary but not sufficient condition. And indeed, you may have heard about Langton's loops or Beil's loops. These satisfy this condition, as does von Neumann's universal self-replicator, for example, when it's programmed to self-replicate. Indeed, there's a certain action that each self-replicator does while it's self-replicating. This is a certain pattern, and then when there are more, when there are multiple self-replicators, then they're also all doing the same action, possibly with a time offset. The other thing you should have in mind, if you've played the game of life or if you're familiar with it, is there's this thing called the Gosper glider gun, which is this device or this gadget. It's a little hard to draw pictures of these things, but it schematically looks like this. It's some configuration in the game of life with some cells, and these things are moving around, which produces these little gliders that go off in this direction. It's a machine. these little guys wiggle around as they glide along, and they have their own little dynamical motif. And indeed, this would be an example of something that satisfies the local self-replicating condition. However, as we discussed from before, this object is sort of like a printer. It's printing like a little glider of these things that are wiggling along. So it doesn't satisfy all of our desires for a system that self-replicates, but nonetheless, it's going to do something. And this is going to be a useful definition to rule out the possibility of a cellular automata being able to furnish universal self-replication. So let me be more precise about this. So armed with our definition, we're going to ask the following question. Does the universality, the computational universality, of a cellular automata imply that it can furnish configurations that self-replicate? So let's unpack what this means, because it's a slightly subtle question. So if I give you a cellular automata which is powerful enough such that you can build a Turing universal computer within it, does that mean that the same cellular automata also has the possibility of building configurations that self-replicate? You might have guessed yes, and in fact, this was sort of baked into these intuitions of von Neumann. You know, he had this universal cellular automata that also had the ability to self-replicate by design. And one might intuit from this that if you can build a computer in your universe, you can also build gadgets or have organisms that reproduce. So how do people, what do you think about this? Do you think it's true or false? We're going to prove one way or the other. It's not an undecidable problem, so we will be able to prove one way or the other. Any thoughts? Anyone want to venture a guess? It will not, if you get it wrong, it will not count against your extra credit. Some of you with extra credit might be willing to gamble. I mean, whatever you want. Anyone?
I would say yes.
Good, that it is true.
Yeah, that it is true.
Yes, very good. Why?
I feel like the existence of a universal Turing machine kind of has this feeling of being able to simulate itself. And so if we have a system that can simulate the universal Turing machine,
Yeah.
it feels like it should be able to simulate itself as well in some way, so replicate itself.
Good. So one subtlety, of course, is that your computer is very, very good at doing simulations, but it cannot yet build another copy of itself. So the intuition that I want to suggest to you is the following. The intuition is, in biology, we have a number of different notions involved in the theory of DNA and RNA. One of these notions is replication, the ability of DNA, for example, to replicate. But we also have transcription and translation, which ultimately is part of the process by which biological systems build molecular machines using proteins. The latter is more like computation. Building the proteins in the molecular machines are kind of the objects that facilitate physical computation. It is a different set of mechanisms than the mechanisms which facilitate replication. They're related, but they're distinct. So you might wonder if you can build a universe which is sort of capable, where the objects in the universe are capable of doing transcription and translation, building machines, but they don't actually have the ability to stably self-replicate. We can cleave apart these two different mechanisms. So we're going to address this answer actually in the negative. We are going to construct, in the last 5 or so minutes, an example of a cellular automaton which is Turing universal, but cannot furnish any configurations that self-replicate. Specifically, it will never be able to furnish anything that satisfies the locally self-replicating condition, weak as it is. It's slightly counterintuitive. Okay. So let's do this. Move over to here. Okay. So how strict is it's 1?
I suggest you take as much time as you need. We will then take a 15-minute break. And
Okay.
then we'll have a shorter.
Okay, I'll take a few extra minutes, but I won't. It's always dangerous to get in the way of people's breaks. So you've covered global universality and local universality? Okay, so you know about the difference between global universality and local universality. So let me tell you what the result is. Because global universality and local universality work in a kind of different way. And then I'll explain to you the construction, and then we can have our break. I get a break too? When we break? Okay. So here's the result. It's that, well, let me write it maybe as a picture. So here's the space of globally universal cellular automata. There's a bigger space, which is, I'll call universal self-replicating, CAs. And there's an even bigger space of what are locally universal CAs. So the theorem is that these containments are strict, meaning that this is actually the correct picture. So what it means is that all globally universal CAs can also furnish universal self-replicators. This is maybe sort of intuitive. It means that if you have any globally universal cellular automaton, it can simulate any other one, including, for example, the von Neumann self-replicator. Now, one caveat is that the von Neumann self-replicator is in 2 dimensions. So you might worry that if you have a 1-dimensional version of it that you're out of luck. But it turns out that there's a way of constructing a 1-dimensional version of von Neumann's universal self-replicator. Slightly surprising. And so therefore, in any dimension, a globally universal cellular automata can simulate basically a universal self-replicator such as von Neumann's construction. Now, what's more surprising, the example that I'm about to describe is really about the latter, this inclusion, about locally universal versus universal self-replicating. So by definition, a universal self-replicating system is locally universal because I'm defining it that way. You can build a Turing machine within it. That's part of the setup. But what's interesting about this strict inclusion, it means that there exists some examples of locally universal cellular automata for which you can build Turing machines, but for which you cannot get self-replicating configurations. So there exist examples that are outside of the purview of universal self-replication that still are locally universal, meaning that you can build computers within them. So that's the surprise. So let me give you the construction, this example of this point, which is Turing universal, but outside of the realm of universal self-replication. Okay. So let me draw an example of a one-dimensional cellular automaton. Now, what I'm going to do is, even though it's one-dimensional, I'm going to draw it in terms of 3 strips. So the way to think about it, if you like, is that I'm going to take each cell and I'm going to subdivide it into 3 cells. So if you like, you can think about the data of one cell as everything which is in a vertical strip of size 3. Is that, people happy with that? Okay. So the idea then is that we're going to, so let's forget the 3rd row for the moment. And what we're going to do is imagine that we're simulating a cellular automata of a Turing machine. So we have a Turing machine whose head is in, which carries the state A, and it can write a bunch of things on a tape like this, and the head will move left and right, and contingent on the tape, it will possibly change what's on the tape, and then change its own state, and then move left or right. So it should be intuitive that you can bake this into a cellular automaton. It's a cellular automata which is sort of designed to emulate a Turing machine in a very literal way. Now the other thing you can do is allow for the possibility of multiple heads. So for example, you can put a second head maybe in state B, and this can move around and also act on the tape. This can move around and act on the tape, and then they might be able to interact with one another when they get too close by. So this part is clear. This is how you just, a sort of simple way, even pictorially, of embedding a Turing machine, a universal one, if you set up the right rules, into a 1D cellular automaton. That seems fine? Okay. It is fine. Does it seem fine is the question. Does it seem fine? Okay. All right. All right, so then what's the basic idea? Well, we haven't used our 3rd row. So what we're going to do is that we're going to have our heads, which are going to move around, have an extra thing which they do. So let me so let me write this out. Let me move B actually over here. It'll make this slightly easier to draw. I'll do one more column. And let's call this 0. So what they're going to do is they're going to imprint some arrows onto this third row. So let's do it like this, for example. Good. And maybe we'll do one like this, and like this, and like this. So the idea is the following. Whenever a head is over a particular configuration, it's going to imprint an arrow of the direction it's going to go next. So for example, this head, when it reached 1, went left. It got all the way to the end, and then it decided, because of the dynamics of the interaction between the head and the tape, that the next place it was going to go was left. So the arrow points left. So this is as far right as this head went. So I'm going to draw a red line there. And likewise, in this case, this B, the farthest left that it went, was here because it went right. And indeed, you can kind of track a bit of the history of what happened until the arrows get replaced by looking at the directionality. So here's the idea. These left and right arrows can serve as kind of domain walls. In other words, this head can kind of know when it's in a region that was touched by A. Because suppose that B enters this region from the right. If it enters this cell from the right, or enter from the right means that it comes this way. It goes to the left, meaning it enters it from the right side. If it sees an arrow that points left, it knows that it could never have visited there before. Because if it had visited there before, it would have to be pointing the opposite way. Right? So in other words, if it enters it from this side and it sees that there's an arrow with the wrong direction, it knows that it's in somebody else's territory. So you can then bake into the rules of the cellular automata that if it enters another head's territory as determined by this mechanism of looking at the directionality of the arrows, then the head will halt. So if it sees an arrow, if it enters a region from the right and it sees that it's pointing to the left, it halts. Or if it enters from a region from the left and it's pointing to the right, then it will also halt. So what does this do? What this does is that it makes it so that none of the heads can talk to each other. Why? Because there's two ways that the heads can talk to each other. One is if they come up next to each other and there's some rule by which they interact, but we can put in the rules of the cellular automata that if they get next to each other, they halt. That's fine. But there's a different way they can communicate, which is via their shared tape. But if we have a rule in which they halt whenever they encroach on someone else's region, on another head's region, this way they will never be able to, the different heads will never be able to communicate with each other because they effectively have disjoint tapes. What this means is that since all of the dynamics of the cellular automata is facilitated by the heads moving around and interacting with the tape, it means that each head is sort of forced to be in a finite or localized region, or possibly half-infinite. But it means that none of the heads can communicate. So if you have any motif or pattern that starts in a finite region, it can't propagate outwards. The other heads are not going to be able to pick up what this other head is throwing down. Right? It will not be able to pick up the pattern of some initial configuration in a finite region. It cannot propagate or be carried off by other heads further away. All right. So that's the basic idea. That's the basic intuition of the proof. And this is clearly an example. If you only had a single head, this is clearly Turing universal by construction. But since all of the dynamics are facilitated by heads, because the heads cannot interact with one another, it limits the propagation of information, and therefore any local pattern that starts in a finite region will only be able to proliferate by a finite amount, and then you will be able to get no more copies of that pattern because of the fact that the heads cannot communicate with one another. This can be rigorously shown, but that's the intuition is the intuition. Okay, so let me conclude. So what we've shown is something slightly counterintuitive, at least initially, which is that local universality, the ability to build a Turing machine, does not mean the ability to have a self-replicating configuration. In other words, if you wanted to build a theory of self-replication, you wanted to ask, when can this set of laws of physics or rules in a cellular automata universe, when can that produce self-replication? It is not enough or even sufficient to say that your laws of physics can have universal Turing machines. That doesn't tell you whether there's self-replication that can happen. So what that tells you is that there's other dynamical and computational mechanisms that are needed to figure out whether self-replication can arise or not, and that it is detached in this way from the local form of Turing universality. So where this leads, and where I'll end, is that it is useful to have precise definitions of necessary conditions in, say, cellular automata for self-replication, even in a simple way, to occur. So if you have some necessary but even weak formulation, you can use it to rule out the possibilities that certain cellular automata can have self-replicating systems. The thing that one really wants to do is build a more comprehensive theory where we have better and better definitions of what it means for a system to furnish self-replicating critters, and then to figure out what actually are the dynamical and computational or informational features of a system that enable that to be possible. So let me end there, and can go on your break.